Hello, welcome to Train Signal. This is the Managing Security lesson in the System Center 2012 Operations Manager Training course. So, why is security so important in the Operations Manager environment? It's pretty simple, really. Operations Manager has its hooks into a significant portion of your technology infrastructure. If you deploy it fully, it has hooks into Exchange, it has hooks into your network, it has hooks into your file servers, and it even's got its claws into Active Directory. Now, it can't necessarily view all the information that's stored inside those systems, but by virtue of the fact that we've got things like run as accounts and run as profiles, users with inappropriate access to Operations Manager could theoretically gain inappropriate access to some of the monitored systems. So, it's important to make sure that Operations Manager is locked down to a reasonable point so that only people who need to view the information can view the information. Further, with the rise of malware and hackers and all that good stuff, making sure that only appropriate systems can access other systems is also a critical element in the security plan for Operations Manager. Now, in this course, we haven't used any firewalls, but they're incredibly important in a true production environment where users may have direct access to servers. And you've seen this before, but I'm going to show it to you again because I think it's that important. The information you see on your screen right now is pretty basic infrastructure for the Operations Manager environment. And you can see that there's different communications ports that are open to and from different systems in this environment. For example, you can see that the management servers need to be able to use port 1433 to talk to the SQL Server cluster. Internally, the management servers in a resource pool are communicating on TCP port 5723. And so on and so forth. You can read the screen. But it tells you exactly which ports need to be open in which direction in order for communication to be able to flow appropriately in your Operations Manager environment. As we begin to add new services to the pool, you start to see that there's a need for new ports to be open. For example, add-in reporting adds additional needs. Now, as we start adding Unix and Linux computers to the pool, we have additional firewall needs that need to be considered as a part of the implementation. And then as we go outside through the firewall to the untrusted network, we're adding yet more firewall ports that need to be considered. So consider this as a baseline configuration for an Operations Manager firewall diagram, but also make sure to refer to Microsoft's more complete documentation on the subject as you move forward with your Operations Manager deployments. Fortunately, Operations Manager does ship with some additional security features beyond just the need to use the Windows firewall. One thing that's important to keep in mind, however, as you move forward, is that you should keep in mind this concept of least privileged security, under which you only grant users the rights they need and no more in order to perform their jobs. And this is something that's really important to keep in mind beyond Operations Manager as well. You wouldn't grant people access to the human resources system unless they needed it, right? So why would you grant people who don't need it access to Operations Manager or any other system in your organization if they don't need it? By providing people with just the rights they need, you're protecting both yourself as well as the user. And actually, in addition, you're protecting the organization. And here's why. You're protecting yourself because if you grant users too many rights and they abuse those rights, you could be held accountable for over providing rights to users, over subscribing them to different resources. You're obviously protecting the organization because the organization is less at risk when users don't have huge levels of access. And finally, you're actually protecting the user. If there's things they just can't do and they never see them, they're not tempted to do them, or they're not suspected of doing them in the event that something happens in the organization. And that's a really key thing. Operations Manager 2012 ships with a number of predefined user roles. Now, I'm not going to sit here and read every word that's on this screen, but I will tell you The most important user roles are the administrator ones. This is the one where a user has access to absolutely everything in the environment. Now, one thing to keep in mind is you cannot do what's called scoping the administrator role. You can't limit the administrator role's access to a subset of functionality in the operations manager environment. The administrator role has access to everything. So be careful who you provide access with administrative privileges to operations manager. Notice the advanced operator role has access to do things like create overrides and things like that. That's a pretty key thing as well, based on some of the things you've already learned in this course. The operator role has the ability to edit or delete alerts, run tasks, and access views according to its configured scope. Now, operators also inherit read-only operator privileges, so they get the ability to view alerts and access views, as well as be able to manipulate those views accordingly. One of the things to bear in mind is that the default user roles in Operations Manager are pretty generous and they're not scoped. Therefore, they have access to the full plethora of information that's found in Operations Manager. Sometimes you may want to allow someone access to just a subset of the console or subset of the functionality. In these cases, you can create a custom role which places limits on what users assigned to the role can see or do. And that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to go over to the Operations Manager environment and we're going to view the existing Operations Manager 2012 roles. Next, we're going to add a user to an existing role. We're going to add a user named Chuck Brown to the administrator group. Then we're going to create new roles. Adding Chuck Brown to the administrator group on the Operations Manager server is all well and good, but it's better to do these things at the Active Directory level, where you're managing all of your other user access anyway. I prefer to work with groups in Operations Manager rather than individual user accounts, although for demonstration purposes, I will use individual user accounts. However, I'd much rather add users to and remove users from an Active Directory group than I would having to constantly manage their access inside Operations Manager. So we're going to create a new Active Directory group for SCOM administrators. Now that group is already created. In fact, it's called SCOM admins. I assume you probably know how to create an Active Directory group. But we're going to add this AD group to Operations Manager's administrators group. And then we're going to create a new role that allows the user Sam Reynolds to view all pertinent Operations Manager objects related to networking, with the operator role being the base. So let's go over to the Operations Manager console and carry out these tasks. And here we are in the Operations Manager console. And as you can see, I've gone to the administration area and I've already selected user roles under the security tab. On the screen, you're going to see all those roles that I talked about having existed in Operations Manager. The first one is the administrator group, and that's the one that's of most interest right now, because remember, I said that our goal was to make sure we added Chuck Brown to the list of administrators. And let's see what happens when we attempt to do that. First of all, we open up the properties page for the administrator group. Before we add Chuck, we'll just take a look at the other tabs. We have the scope, tasks, dashboards, and views. Now, author scope is what can be changed. For example, authoring. We've talked about creating overrides and monitors and things like that. Group scope provides access to viewing things. What tasks can this user perform? And what dashboards and views can the user view? But let's add this single user to this role. Well, right now you'll see that it says select group. So we'll click object type, and you'll notice we don't get an opportunity to add a single user. Operations Manager also works under the paradigm that it's better to work with Active Directory than it is to just try to do everything inside Operations Manager. Therefore, you're not allowed to add a single user to the Operations Manager role for administrator. But we can add SCOM admins, which is one of our other tasks. And actually, without telling you behind the scenes, I already had added Chuck Brown to the SCOM admins group, knowing that we would not be able to add him as a single user. And now, anybody we add to the the SCOM admins group will have full rights to the Operations Manager console and to all functions within Operations Manager. Now our next task was to add basically a scoped Operations Manager operator role. So let's do that. We're going to right-click User Roles. We're going to choose New User Role Operator. And the goal was to allow this user to be able to view everything to do with networking and do some manipulations. So we're going to call this Networking Operator. Now notice here we can add users or groups. And again, I'm going to break my rule, but we're going to add Sam Reynolds. For the administrative one, we had to use a group. Here we can use users or groups. And do next. So we want them to be able to monitor anything to do with networking. So we scroll down the list and look for things that do with networking. Network devices group. And we have a couple of other networking groups here. We may see something in the infrastructure group, although that has to do with Operations Manager. So we got the network devices group and the Operations Manager network ICMP and SNMP only devices. And that's good for now. Click Next. We're going to allow this user to execute any tasks that they can see. Remember, they're scoped to only be able to see certain tasks anyway, because they won't see tasks that have to do with things outside the networking area. And the same goes for dashboards. We'll allow them to see the dashboards that they would like to. Actually, we'll go ahead and limit this just for kicks so you can see how to do that. So we'll choose only the dashboards and views in each tab are approved. And network monitoring. This is an important warning. This one basically says that if you add new views to the network monitoring folder, you're going to have to come back and do this process again for this user. And that's because only the views that currently exist will be added to the security context for this user role. Notice we have a tasks pane as well. Again, this is going to allow user access to certain things from the task pane. I'm not too worried about what we see here. What we've already done over here is plenty for this. What we want for this user to be able to accomplish. Click Next, and then Create. And you can see now in the operator profile we have a networking operator. And if we go to the properties page, it's pretty significantly scoped as to what's allowed and what's not allowed. And that's how you manage Operations Manager 2012 user roles. Now, this is a topic we've talked about before, but I want to reiterate it here because it's an important part of the Operations Manager security paradigm. First of all, we have management pack objects. Now, these objects include discoveries, monitors, rules, and tasks. And these objects need appropriate rights to work against managed objects in the environment. And what are managed objects? Those are things like the servers to which you're installing the Operations Manager agent, or the network switches that you plan to monitor using SNMP, and what have you. Basically, things need credentials in order to do their jobs. If you don't have an SNMP community string, you won't be monitoring a switch, for example. In fact, different objects might require different credentials to be targeted. You may have two of the same kind of object running, and each one requires different sets of credentials. This is what we're going to talk about here. Run as accounts and profiles. What is a run as account? It is a set of credentials and distribution rules for those credentials. Basically, it's a set of usernames and passwords and rules about how those usernames and passwords are shared among different systems in the organization. A profile is an association of run as accounts to systems monitored by particular management packs. So using the profiles, you start to determine which systems are going to get which sets of accounts. And with targeting, you get the ability to supply different run as account credentials for different instances of the same service on a single computer. Now here's some of the things that happened when we installed Operations Manager. Let's just talk about the accounts that are used, for example, by the data warehouse component. This is just a sample. We're not going to create these because they're already created. There is a data warehouse write account, and this is used by Operations Manager to write new information to the data warehouse database. Now, it also needs to be able to read information from the operations database. In order to work, this account has to be a domain account, and you remember we had to provide the credentials for this when we installed Operations Manager. As far as writes go, to the data warehouse database, this account was granted write privileges, and to the operations database, the account has been granted read privileges. The data warehouse reader account is used to run reports, and also needs to be a domain account, and is granted read privileges to the data warehouse database. It's also added to the Operations Manager Report Security Administrator's role in Operations Manager. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to do two things. One, we're going to review the installed run as accounts that are already present in Operations Manager. And second, we're going to create an account that we'll use for SNMP discovery in this course. And we are back in the console. I'm back in the administration area, and I'm going to go to accounts. And again, there's not tons of accounts here yet, but you'll notice that we have our SCOM action account, which is the action account we created at installation time. We also have the local system action account. And this is basically a way that agents can use the local system account to carry out their actions. The local system account is a special account in Windows that provides full access to the system for our purposes here with Operations Manager. We also have some Windows accounts. We've got the Data Warehouse Report Deployment account, local system Windows account again, the network action accounts, and the network service Windows account. Again, the network service is another built-in Windows service that you can use if necessary. We're going to create a run as account here. And this is going to be for SNMP purposes. So we're going to create a community string. By the way, the reason we're not doing SNMP v3 is it's not horribly widely, it is out there, but most network devices will use at least SNMP 1 or 2, which uses a community string for its authentication. SNMP v3 uses more powerful authentication. And you'll notice that this is a community string for SNMP v1 or SNMP v2 devices. Almost every default network device uses this community string public to be able to access publicly available metrics like port counters and things like that. And that doesn't mean it's counting ports. It means it's going to tell you some statistics about that port. For example, how much bandwidth is going in and how much bandwidth is going out. Now, how do we want to distribute this thing? Do you want to use the less secure option, which says I just want it to go to all managed computers, which means that any system can use the account? Or do I want to manually select the computers to which the credentials will be distributed? For our purposes here, we're just going to keep the default of more secure. Elsewhere in this course, when we start discovering network devices, then we'll tell it to use this account as a part of the discovery process. We now have created an SNMP community string that will now associate with a run as profile. And if we scroll down, you'll notice there's an SNMP monitoring accounts profile. So I'll double click it. And we'll just run through the information here. The introduction page is just that, an introduction. General properties. Okay. It's going to save this in the network management library. And the run as accounts will be the SNMP community string that we just created. It's going to be used to manage all targeted objects. Basically, anything that requires an SNMP community string will use this run as accounts. And save. And now we're told, well, we need to make sure that these are distributed around to different systems in the organization. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll tap the SNMP community string, and we'll allow it to be distributed automatically to all managed computers. Now, this doesn't really matter that much for the SNMP community string because mostly the work is going to be done from the management server itself anyway, but we'll go ahead and allow the SNMP community string to be distributed more broadly to the different systems in the organization. Again, the SNMP community string is not particularly secure to begin with, so from a security perspective, we're not leaving ourselves at much risk. Now you're going to notice there's a whole lot of profiles that have been created since we installed Operations Manager. Different management packs will add different profiles. And I promised you earlier on in this course you'd see some of these profiles in action. Well, you just got to see how we create the SNMP or the network monitoring profile. And you'll get to see that actually get used when we do the networking lesson in this course. And that is it for the security portion of this course. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.